Thank you. So it's a bit stuffy here. Can we stand up for a second? Just stretch a bit, move around. It's been a lot of talks, lots in the brain, so just move a bit, jump if you feel like it, and make it a little, Cool. Okay, so just a show of hands. Who here works for an intelligence agency? Okay, we have one person actually, so I'll be careful. So I made this talk originally for the DIAC day that Vitalik is like making these days, and that one I only had 8 minutes, so I'm gonna be a bit slow today. I'm actually a very slow person. I'm not really into accelerationism, unless it's a US dollar abolitionism. But yes, so how to abolish the US dollar and the future of crypto. So I'm Julio. I'm an economic anthropologist. I also work on poetic technologies. Today's views are about mostly my work on a book I'm writing called Decolonizing Money, and also some of the work that I've been doing and we've been doing with my teams over the years with circles and now poetic tech. So here we go. Economics 101. This is what they should have taught you in school, but probably didn't. So how does the US dollar system actually work? So in 1973, Richard Nixon unpegged the dollar from gold. At the time, you could buy an ounce of gold for $35. And that was the sort of standard that we had from the post-war era, the Bretton Woods Agreement, all the way to '73. At the time, Nixon was trying to pay for the war in Vietnam. He was running out of gold reserves, so his ability to go into deficit was limited by the amount of gold, effectively, right? I think France was buying a lot of them. And so what they came up with in the Pentagon was to say, what if we just unpeg ourselves from gold and become the world's currency, reserve currency? And also, therefore, the unit of account of the world. Now, a year later, with the OPEC crisis, the US convinced Saudi Arabia to accept payment for oil only in US dollars. And that's the beginning of what we now call the petrodollar system, which is a system whereby today, any nation in the world can only buy and sell oil in US dollars. And that is important because it is what, if you think of oil today as still the hegemonic energy system of the planet, it is a way of capturing the production system, and therefore also labor. So you cannot really have a transition, an ecological or economic transition, unless we unlink ourselves from this relationship between the dollar and oil. So that nexus is very important. And so how is this system enforced? If any country wants to escape from this regime, they will be visited in their door by the US Army. And so many people don't know this, but actually a lot of the value of the dollar comes from the violence of the US Army. Today, the US Army has over 800 US bases, army bases around the world. The biggest one is in Germany, actually. And in most of their allies in Korea, Japan, that's where most of the US Army bases are. And then we come to like dollars and treasury IOUs. What is a treasury IOU? It's effectively a promise of future dollars. So today, investors who want to get a risk-free or low-free investment, they can buy US treasury bonds at specific maturity rates. They can be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and then eventually get dollars with interest on them. So it's effectively a very cyclical system. As you can tell, it's a triadic structure. And so why does it matter? So today, if you think about the US dollar, the US government's credit card, when they go into debt, when they go into deficit, when they create money, famously the Fed issues money as debt and then it's monetized as US dollars into the banking sector and into the industry sector. Who actually pays for that? If you think about this system as a world tributary system, what central banks all over the world do when they hold dollars and promises of future dollars or treasury IOUs is effectively giving the US their surpluses, their an interest-free loan, effectively. So it's a very strange system. Some people call it a super imperialism, this kind of system, or uber imperialismus, in the sense that it's the first time in history where a state has managed to tax the whole world into paying tribute to them in its own currency. And so this is the system that we're dealing with. And basically, it's a form of extraction from the peripheries to the center. Most countries in the world today have to pay 1/3 to half of their national incomes in debt payments. serviced to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which are appendages, institutions of the US imperial industrial complex. And so that's more or less how the system works. Any questions so far? Cool. So what do I mean by abolition? And what do I mean by democracy here? So abolition democracy is a term that W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous sociologist from the US, was writing at the dawn of the end of slavery in the United States, where he argued that formerly freed slaves were not welcome out of slavery with new democratic institutions so that they could have the means of subsistence to be welcome out of slavery, right? Former slaves became wage slaves or wage laborers without any equal footing to, let's say, non-slaves, right? And so abolition democracy is a vision of justice that seeks to dismantle oppressive structures and systems while simultaneously creating democratic, equitable ones for society. So it's not just about the dismantling or the abolition of systems, in this case the US dollar and the US dollar institutions. It's also about creating counter-institutions that are democratic to take their place once those systems are abolished. So that is what abolition democracy means. In today's world, there is people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilmore Gibson who argue about the abolitionism in the context of prisons in the US. Where famously 1% of the population is in prisons within the US. The majority of that are black people, so you there see the aftermaths of slavery. And so I try to apply this concept to the realm of money, which is, as you can see from that previous triad that I showed you, is maybe another form of doing abolitionism. By actually tackling the monetary part, you can actually potentially also abolish these other systems. So, but why? What is the justification for my argument? Why do we need to abolish the US dollar? So the first one, and I already alluded to it, is based on energy and ecological arguments. So today's production system and labor are structurally controlled by this oil money nexus. So far as, insofar as we have technical alternatives with different energy technologies, such as solar or wind, that are actually more effective and cost efficient, they will not thrive because, structurally speaking, if you look at the distribution of investments that banks today do when they fund projects, they mostly fund non-renewable energy projects in comparison to renewables. Like, there is a very good piece by this in Bank Track, which is a Dutch entity that looks at how banks do investments. And structurally speaking, because of this military coinage complex of the USA, there isn't really any incentive for banks to go outside of that nexus, right? So while we do have the alternatives and while there are countries developing technologies there, structurally we still are yet to be able to make that transition. And the other thing is that, of course, we cannot have infinite debt, infinite growth of debt in a finite planet. Why? Because debt is really the driver of what people now are calling economic growth, as in the expansionary extractive way in which resources are taken from the earth, also labor, and many other things. So if we imagine it as like a way in which the US has this infinite deficit that they can just keep printing money, that translates into climate change in the form of more fossil fuels and more extractivism, right? It doesn't mean that we don't need production. It doesn't mean that we don't need supplies to produce things. But the way that is structurally made today is such to fuel consumerism and the production of fast commodities, right, that perish fast. The second argument is actually on the grounds of economic democracy. For me, the abolition of the dollar is a means towards achieving economic democracy. And so today, some of us are lucky enough to live in systems that are sort of more or less politically democratic. So people get to choose their leaders every 4 years. Of course, we shouldn't confuse voting with democracy, but it is way better than dictatorial regimes or plutocratic regimes, which we unfortunately have in the crypto world. So economic democracy is something that we really don't have. People don't really get to own or control the means of production at a local level. And so for me, abolishing the dollar is a step in that direction because it will allow us to first cancel debt, all these imperialist debts I mentioned with the IMF and the World Bank. If countries could be released from this servicing, they could then use that wealth to fund other things, basic infrastructure, basic services, and also, I argue, a planetary but local first basic income. Circus was an attempt that I tried to do this in practice, have many critiques of it, but at the same time, I think that direction of thought is definitely worthwhile exploring because we live in a planetary system at this point. So we have to think about global solutions to local solutions to global problems. So what's the role of crypto in the fall of the dollar? So the story so far, right? Trump, actually, the Trump administration, funnily enough, has this weird two-pronged, seemingly contradictory strategy where they both want to devalue the dollar while maintaining its global dominance. No? This whole argument about bringing production back into the US and making America great again is based on this type of arguments. And one of the weapons that Trump has in his pocket to do this is tariffs, right? Which we've seen him use in very strange ways as a form of so-called economic protectionism, even though it's not really the historical form of economic protectionism that we see in nation states. But the other aspect of this is crypto. So you could think about this as a promissory time bomb. You know, the history of money is filled with broken promises, particularly in the sense of convertibility. So as I mentioned, during the end of the gold standard and before that, there were always these moments where states couldn't hold the promise of a specific regime, and then they had to transition out of them, right? This is what I think is happening with the dollar today. And so by accepting Bitcoin and USD stablecoins, these retail stablecoins, as legitimate reserves, there's actually a very funny website in the White House, which is like a fact-checking of all of this. You can check it out, it's very interesting. What Trump is actually doing is accelerating systemic risk by coupling assets, volatile assets, like Bitcoin, to the rest of the economy. So whenever there is a shock to the system, and in the level of these speculative markets, that will eventually impact all the other sectors. No? So we see this rising systemic risk. So Trump wants to leverage, his agenda is to leverage stablecoins to get other countries to invest their dollars, say Japan, who holds trillions of dollars, into the US, by saying that, to them that, oh, the Fed will accept stablecoins now. So please take your dollars, transform them into crypto dollars, and give them to us. Right, this is their strategy, it seems. But the problem is, of course, that these retail USD crypto stablecoins cannot be fully regulated or controlled by the Fed. Right? So if you look at it historically, like today, most of money creation happens through not state money like the Fed, but actually bank money. So banks create most of the dollars in existence through debt. And now this is becoming even more spread out as these retail companies like Tether and Goldman Sachs and others start to issue their own private US dollars, right? So that means that the control that the state has over the money supply is weakening over time. And so, has anyone seen Tether's reserves? No, right? So there is a big controversy about this. So when the convertibility fails, the promise of the dollar will break. And so, ironically, Trump is likely our biggest ally in toppling down the US monetary imperialism. If you think about it, it's kind of funny because a Democrat will never be able to get away with it. It's only a right-wing nationalist populist person that can actually get away with it, which is sort of weird, but hey, that's how the US works. The dollar is already on its way down. So it's not a matter of if the dollar will fall, but when, how, and what can we do about it? So one question I pose to you is how can we preempt Trump's top-down strategy with a more bottom-up approach to deal the fatal blow to the dollar and actually have a self-determined transition, which we deeply need. So here I have some US dollar abolitionist guidebook. I will only focus on the first part since it's about monetary sabotage and you're all hackers and cryptographers, so I'm wondering to think with you about these questions. So the first type of monetary sabotage is about counterfeiting. Counterfeiting has been used historically by states to basically do forms of economic sabotage on each other. The British did it to the US government when it first started. Within the US Civil War, the North was counterfeiting the grayback, which was the name of the currency of the South. But also anarchists have been doing this. So Lucio Urturbia is a famous Spanish anarchist who counterfeited many Citibank checks in the 70s that almost led to the fall of Citibank. And they chose bank traveler checks because the fine on it was less than actually counterfeiting US dollars. But actually in more recent history, there is this interesting case that happened when at the dawn of Donald Trump's second election, the Chinese government created a financial product that was effectively a US Treasury bill made in China, and they sold it to the Saudi government. So now the Saudis have the option to exit and say, the dollars that we get from oil, instead of recycling them to the war machine, to the US, we can give them to China. And so the question I have is, can we do the same in the crypto world? Could we make crypto equivalent US Treasury bonds? Second method is what I call shorting the dollar. Now, in the 1990s, I think it was, the infamous George Soros did a huge trade where he basically devalued the price of the pound, gaining him billions of pounds at the expense of basically fucking everyone over. So he won a lot of enemies, not just the elite, but also many working class people. So my question here is, how could we short the dollar in a way where we can think about it in a class conscious way? So if we short the dollar and the dollar falls, how could that money be used to redistribute to the people that are actually suffering the most from the growing inflation that we see today? The third one is DDoS the dollar. Who here knows what DDoS is? Can you please spell it out for me?
Distributed denial of service.
And what does that do?
It makes servers go down because lots of people overflooded with connections.
Exactly. So if we were to DDoS the dollar, I think this is more of a time-based type of side channel attack, in the sense that you could DDoS the dollar institutional service, in moments where it really matters. So for example, the the Federal Reserve of the United States has what they call swap lines, which are credit lines to other central banks, and they give them liquidity in times of crisis, particularly in the corona crisis, but in moments when they critically need money, the swap lines are activated. So these are, I think, attacks that we can do at specific moments to deal, like to borrow from Chinese medicine, points at the right part of the body so that we can actually change the way things are going. Now, an anarchist cybernetician friend of mine actually posed this next method to me, and I thought it was quite nice, which is to make organized tax and payment strikes for the dollar. So this is a method that anyone can actually do that lives in the US, for example. They can say, today we will not accept payment in dollars and we will not pay in dollars, or we will not use our money to pay taxes in dollars because it funds the war machine. We can instead use it for other things. So this is a form of organized strikes that have been done throughout history, but at the level of the money system, at the level of payments, and the level of paying taxes. I think tax resistance is the term that people use for it in the US. The fifth one relates a little bit to a protocol that I had the luck to work on it a bit, called Cycles, which is more about canceling trade debt. So all countries in the world have surplus and deficit accounts with one another as they do trade, and a lot of that is denominated in dollars. The dollar is, I think it's 85% of world trade is denominated in dollars. So if you could look at those relationships in a graph, and you can look at the cycles within that and the world trade, you could actually cancel a lot of the world debt that we have just by the mere act of doing mathematics. So that is a very simple way in which you could already weaken a lot the power of the dollar by canceling a lot of the debt that is already inherent within the graph, within the system, and so on and so on and so on. So I don't intend to give you a complete list of all the methods. It's a work in progress, and it's just to get people thinking about in this direction. So, just to end up on like some of poetic explorations into the future of crypto, you've all probably heard about Circles. Circles is a peer-to-peer protocol that allows people the power to issue their own money in the form of a personal ERC20 token beyond states and banks. Now, there's many problems with Circles. There's many critiques I have about it. Like we mentioned it during the day, there is no privacy, and so on and so on. But I think it's a good way to get us thinking in the direction of what would it take to claim and democratize the power to issue money away from states and banks and into the realm of the commons, into the realm of people. The second thing has to do with democratizing the power to destroy money. Here, specifically, I mean it in the form of canceling debt. So as I mentioned in the example before of canceling trade debt, this next protocol, Cycles, by Informal Systems, led by the great Ethan Buchman, is an open credit clearing protocol, where the goal is to cancel the most amount of debt with the least amount of money in a privacy-preserving way, which is, I think, is a very nice innovation. Some of the other work that I've been thinking about recently is to make a quantum-like money system using physical unclonable functions, or POFs, which I won't get into the history of that because it's very geeky right now, but anyways. And then also money systems in general that are offline first and local first, hedging for internet collapse. So how could we make monetary systems using the cryptographic primitives that we have today so that you can do payments that are like cash without having to rely on the hegemonic internet infrastructure? So, thank you. This is my contacts on Signal, Telegram, and my email. Please pre-order my book. You can scan there the code, and my book comes out in early spring next year. So yeah, feel free to contact me if you want to hang out, if you want to invest in Poetic, or if you just want to collaborate and abolish the dollar together. Thank you.
A few questions to Julio. Who want to go? You should go with a question to Julio. Yeah.
Well, I will just improvise. I also don't like the dollar, and I thought a lot in the last years how to basically obfuscate also paying taxes in my country, in Italy, because I saw clearly how much all this money is used for something that I'm not like resonating with. And I personally didn't understood clearly the DDoS attack on the dollar, but always keep like trying to understand how to again push down this, because I see this very clearly in my everyday life, how much the dollar is there, always backing everything. I mean, coming from Italy is easy because, you know, we have a pretty relationship with that country. Yeah, so first of all, DDoS, I didn't understood, and how do you feel? I think for Italians personally is a lot also about culture, like how all this money and the culture flooded into our culture, and this is not easy to detach from, because actually even if I use euro, it's the same thing at the end. So
yeah, it's a great question. So I think generally speaking, one takeaway I would like you to get from this talk is that what we should be doing with all these methods is to destroy the trust that people have in the dollar, which, as I said, Trump is already helping us to do, but we can do more. You know, when it comes to the DDoS attacks, as Cassandra mentioned, basically you can think about it as like, imagine everyone in this room or everyone in the conference starts to send requests to the servers that control the databases of the dollar, where you flood them and then they just break because they cannot be, you know, they cannot handle so many requests at once. So that is, it's a cybernetic attack. It's not a physical attack. Yeah.
We have 1 minute more for a question. Yeah.
Actually, not a question, but a remark to your US dollar abolitionist list. I would add the climate change or the reuse of fossil fuels on that list. Yeah? If we don't buy that much oil and gas, it will also be a valid point to reduce the dominance of the dollar.
You mean like divestment from fossil fuels? Yes. Yeah, of course.
Here?
Yeah, maybe one thing that you have already mentioned is debt cancellation, and I'm wondering, I'd love to hear your perspective on what do you think we can all do when it comes to debt canceling, also in our own private lives, not buying into this, you know, notion of debt as we grew up with, but how can we reframe that for ourselves, and how can we start canceling debt?
Yeah, so for example, there is a very nice collective in the United States called the Debt Collective. And what they've done is that they managed to organize debtors, like the debtor classes if you want, to organize and strike against their creditors. So you can do that at the bank level. It depends on the structure that we're dealing with, but definitely organizing within the debtors' unions or whatever you want to call them, it's a way to start. Because alone, it's hard to fight a bank. But if you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owes you. But if you owe the bank $1 million, you own the bank, right? So it's about the power dynamics. There was a question there. I don't know if there's
We're
time. but-
running out of
Okay,
time.
you can ask me later.
Thank